In the early 70s, had always driven sports cars on the road, and my brother, I always blame it on him. He said, wouldn't it be great if, and I was always getting rid of one to get another one, he said, wouldn't it be great if you had a bunch of different ones, that you could try out, and something sort of snapped in my head, and here I am, broke but happy, 15 years later. This is the oldest car I have, which is a 1917 Duesenberg Indianapolis car. It's typical of all the racing cars before 1920 because it's just great, big, and strong. That's the best thing you can say about them. There's nothing elegant, nothing very refined about them. It's got a huge four-cylinder engine with what they call walking beams. It's got these levers on either side that do that, and the valves do this. And they made 8-valve versions and 16-valve versions, and this is the only 16-valve car that survives. And I traded a lot of cars to get into this one. A nice old fellow out on Long Island had taken it apart. He used to drive it around on the roads. Had some wonderful pictures of him driving around on the roads. Took it apart, didn't get it back together, so I got it and sent it over to England and had it all put together. And there are all kinds of great stories with every car. When you trace the ownership, this car was owned in the 20s by a retired circus performer who kept it in a log cabin kind of a thing, where he also kept his bear that was left over from the circus. And this was in upstate New York, and during the parades, the annual parades, he and the bear would drive down the main street of town in this car. This car is quite fast. I've been over 100 miles an hour in it. But it just won't stop because it doesn't have any brakes on the front, and it has very primitive brakes on the back. So it really should be driven on a track as opposed to a road course. In the teens and 20s, they had these board tracks all over this country, which were wooden kind of saucers, and you could go flat out all the way around. They were very steeply banked, and so when you drive this thing on a road course, you're really not doing what it was designed to do. And okay, so moving on from there. This is a Bugatti Brescia, which was designed before the First World War, and they made a few of them. And the Germans overran the Bugatti factory twice, right after the First World War and after the Second World War. And they had made 3 of these things in 1914, and they knew the Germans were coming, so they took them apart and wrapped them in oily rags and buried them in the factory yard. And then after the war, they came back to the factory, put them together, and won a famous race at Brescia, Italy. Therefore, this kind of Bugatti is known as the Brescia. Now, Bugatti is the most interesting car personality, in my opinion, because he was not trained as an engineer. He was trained as an artist. His father was a portrait painter, made decorative chimneys. Did all this crazy stuff that didn't have anything to do with mechanical things. And so Bugatti designed things by just sort of grokking how a part should be. And he had this amazing tie in his mind between how a part should look and its function. They said that as he was really into thoroughbred horses, and they said as he could judge the foot of a really good horse, so could he judge the forces that would go into a particular car part. And he sketched everything in 3 dimensions, and then he had a bunch of sort of closet engineers that would do the math to actually check out the pieces. But you get the pieces on Bugattis are so satisfying because they all have this wonderful sense of sort of design and beauty. And he said if it looks right, it is right. And so there's this aesthetic tie to the actual function of the car, gives them a sort of a different dimension that you don't get on some of the other cars. Bugatti went on from this thing, this Brescia, and they made road versions and racing versions. This is a racing car. It looks kind of cute and spindly, but it's not. It's a very tough car. They used to race 6 and 7 hours on dirt roads with great big chuck holes and stuff. And so there's a very, very, very brawny little car. And Bugatti had sort of made 3 and 4 of everything he'd made until this, and this one really put him in in a world-class basis to make road cars, racing cars, and make him the sort of the world name that he then became. This next Bugatti is a copy of a 1923 Bugatti Grand Prix car, it was an early experiment in aerodynamics. And it's a copy. I'll explain about that in a minute. But in some ways, it's fairly successful. I had a modern aerodynamicist that told me just recently. He said a lot about this car is very much in line with current thinking on aerodynamics. The fact that it's flat on the sides, that it has a very long tail, and I told him that they had wheel covers in the old days. He said a lot of that is really good. He said the front of a car really doesn't make much difference. It's not how you enter the car, it's how you turn loose of the air after you've penetrated it. But there's only one original Bugatti tank in the world. That's what it's nicknamed. And we talked our way into a museum in France, and this guy that's restored so many cars for me sketched up the entire car in 2 hours. We only had 2 hours to do it. And he sketched every rivet, the way the axles work, the steering gear, the body, the whole thing. And 2 hours, 2 years later, presented me with this car. We had the engine for it, and he made all the rest of it, the transaxle, everything. It's a real tour de force of craftsmanship. And the making of new cars is a temptation to do that in historic racing because they are so expensive. It's very much frowned upon unless it's some bizarre thing of which there are no examples around it. And then it's sort of excused if you come up with something that everybody was sort of interested in and wanted to see what it was like anyway. And you have to be very honest. Well, I made practically the whole thing. If you fudge and say, well, we did have quite a bit of the original car, then that's not so good. The next one is these two are the green one and the red one here are Indianapolis racing cars. This one from the mid-20s and this one from the late 20s. And Miller was the great American genius, and he similarly had an aesthetic tie between how he drew his pieces, how they looked, and how they actually functioned. And he was part of an amazing triumvirate of fellows. So one was Leo, and he was the sort of concepts man, the genius, the dreamer. Then he had a very practical man named Leo Guzman, who was the draftsman, who would figure out how these crazy things that Miller conceived could actually be made in a production setting. And then there's a third guy, Offenhauser, who was the shop foreman, who was a very good craftsman, who could actually make these difficult pieces. And the shops were out in L.A., and the cars were extremely fast. This car would have lapped at about 100 miles an hour in Indianapolis, and this one over here would have lapped at about 115. Our tracks flat out all the way around where they would have probably gone 135, 140 in a circle. This car, the problem with the Millers is that most of them were modified to extinction, so that there wasn't anything left of the original cars. The Europeans, with their sense of sort of cosmic materialism, usually realized that Grand Prix cars were artifacts to be sort of revered and preserved, whereas Americans, bless their hearts, would say, oh, this is something, well, let's just cut 2 feet out of the chassis and put a new motor in it, and get this axle. So at the end of the day, there really aren't any Millers that have survived. This one, a guy in the early 30s, fortunately realized that it was something to be preserved and therefore kept it together. This is 122 cubic inches, or 2-liter, which was what they did in the mid-20s. In the late 20s, the Millers all the way through the 20s got smaller and faster. The engines kept getting only half as big. They'd be much, much faster. This car we have just finished, and it is a recreation. This is quite an original car, and this is not. We started with the engine and transmission, which we got from a nice old fellow in Colorado Springs, and luckily all the Miller drawings survived, so much of this car was made in England. The frame, the body, and a lot of the hardware was made. I got bits and pieces from 20 different guys that would allow me to have stuff off of them. And but anyway, I just raced this car out of Monterey and passed all the Bugattis but one. And it is also a straight 8. It has a typical blower in the back. It produces, in stock form, 154 horsepower out of 1,500 cc's, which is a lot of specific output. In a tweaked up form, there was a guy named Frank Lockhart who won the race in 26, and he would get 250 horsepower out of 1,500 cc's. So the Millers were a phenomenal engine. And